everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for a members-only webinar. I'm Lauren Miller, Membership Director and Volunteer Coordinator at the Olana Partnership. Before we get started, I just wanted to give a special thanks to our members that are participating in today's webinar. We really appreciate your continuous support during this time. You can support Olana by joining or renewing your membership by visiting olana.org/membership. In addition, we have recently launched our virtual membership level, which is only $25 annually. This member level offers digital benefits such as invitations to all our virtual membership programming and discounts at our online museum store. If anyone has questions about this new membership level, feel free to reach out. Please join me in welcoming the moderator for tonight, Carolyn Keogh, Director of Education and Public Programming for the Olana Partnership. Carolyn will be introducing Sean Sawyer, President of the Olana Partnership.
Thanks so much for your introduction, Lauren. I'm thrilled to welcome the partnership's own Sean Sawyer for tonight's webinar, kicking off our fall 2022 webinar series. Sean Sawyer has served as the Washburn and Susan Oberwager President of the Olana Partnership since May of 2015. He received a BA summa cum laude in Art History and Archaeology from Princeton University in 1988 and his PhD in Architectural History from Columbia University in 1999. Prior to joining Olana, Sean was the Executive Director of the Royal Oak Foundation, the American partner of the National Trust of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. He began his nonprofit career as Executive Director of the Wyckoff Farmhouse Museum in East Flatbush, Brooklyn. Welcome, Sean. I'm so looking forward to hearing this talk, which I know was originally given at Mountaintop Arboretum in August. And I think that you're going to present us with some really exciting insights into Olana and a new way of looking at our landscape, which is great for this time of year with all of our leaves turning. And I'm just thrilled to listen to what you have to say this evening. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. And I'm really looking forward to having some time for questions and discussion. And, I do appreciate the opportunity that Mountaintop Arboretum gave me. If you haven't been up there, it's a beautiful, beautiful place in the Catskills, up part of the Onteora community near Tannersville. And it really was a great reason to be able to get back and review so many wonderful sort of documents that I took on board when I first arrived at Olana, including our historic landscape report, and I do owe this talk owes a significant debt to that document and Bob Toole, the landscape architect historian who was behind that. I also want to thank our curatorial team, particularly Ida Breyer, archivist and librarian, and Allegra Davis, who is now our associate curator, for their support and help in pulling together images and questions as it evolved. So let's see, let me get the PowerPoint up and we'll proceed. A New York State historic site and a National Historic Landmark, Olana is the masterwork of Frederic Church, America's preeminent landscape artist. Olana operates in a public-private partnership, and the Olana Partnership is the private educational nonprofit that is responsible for all public-facing operations, including all public tours, educational programs, and exhibitions. To the degree that Olana is known, in a national sense, certainly, it is primarily as America's most intact artist home and studio, and as a locus for the American landscape painting movement, known as the Hudson River School. Today, I want to speak to a broader and a deeper understanding of Olana as a foundational site for environmental consciousness, specifically rooted in Church's intimate knowledge of and passion for the native forest. First, I want to ensure that you understand that Olana is not a house. It contains an entrancing house. However, as this plan drawn by Church's son, also Frederic, testifies, Olana is a designed artist environment, a landscape composition in which architectural features are integrated and in which residential, agricultural, and recreational needs were addressed, and which served Church, the artist, as studio, as subject, and as muse. To understand how this came about and what it means, we need to go back to Church's artistic beginnings. Frederic Church was born into a prominent family in Hartford, Connecticut on May 4th of 1826. And by the time he was a teenager, he had determined that he wanted to be an artist, specifically a landscape artist. His father, we think, reluctantly agreed, stipulating that he study with the best teacher possible. And he was in a position to know exactly who that was through his friend Daniel Wadsworth, who you see here in a portrait by Thomas Sully, the country's most prominent art patron and collector. Wadsworth played an important role in advancing the career of Thomas Cole and asked him to look kindly upon the young man from Hartford. Here you see Cole's portrait, photographic portrait. And above you see the key phrase from 18-year-old Frederic Church's letter to Cole, imploring to be taken on as a student, ensuring him that my highest ambition lies in excelling in art. Cole assented, and Church's father arranged to pay for his tutelage and lodging with Cole and his family in Catskill. And this red arrow traces the short but very formative path west that Church took in June of 1844. The 2 years that Church spent with Cole from age 18 to 20 provided not only the foundations of his artistic practice, but also shaped his emotional response to nature and human impact on it. On the first count, compare this oil study, an oil sketch made by Church around the age of 16 in the Olana collection, with this early work only 6 years later. The young man's artistic development was remarkable. As Cole noted, Church had, quote, the finest eye for drawing in the world, end quote. And in this same year, 1849, he was elected a full member of the National Academy of Design at age 23, the youngest ever at that time. Church had learned the fundamentals of academic practice over Cole's shoulder, how the distinction between representation and art was the same as that between prose and poetry. To make great paintings in the studio that would speak to larger truths and ideas, one had first to observe and document the natural world in as much variety and detail as possible. In other words, to learn composition and iconography over Cole's shoulder, Church had to first walk in his footsteps through the Catskills. To paint the windswept pine, you see here on the right, convincingly enough to give it symbolic life as the painting's principal character, Church had to first study and sketch 100 pine trees. This young Church did with gusto and with the developing eye of a naturalist and the ever surer draftsmanship of a master. Here you see examples of his surviving sketches of individual trees made that first month in Catskill. There are also maples, elms, and butternuts. He seems to be making a catalog of native species, just as a genre painter would study different classes and ages of human life. By the following year, Church's powers of eye and pencil had grown considerably, to say nothing of his stamina for hiking. Take, for instance, this study of the Catskill Mountain House from a vantage point north along the escarpment towards Sunset Rock, made in July of 1845, with the beautifully detailed sketch of the hotel complex in the upper left and a somewhat sketchy rendering of the pine in the foreground. A month later, he returned to give the tree its due, perhaps considering casting it in a leading role in a projected composition. Beyond technical mastery, Church's 2 years with Cole also gave him a deep-seated respect and empathy for the natural world, and opened his eyes to the devastating effects of human progress or civilization. For it was Cole who just a decade earlier in his essay on American scenery decried, quote, the ravages of the axe, quote, and spoke of the beauty, magnificence, and sublimity of the country's natural resources as belonging to every American, and, quote, how undeserving of such a birthright if he can turn towards it an unobserving eye, an unaffected heart, end quote. I think it is reasonable to project that the young Church heard many such pronouncements around Cole's dinner table. Certainly, it is hard otherwise to imagine that the firmly middle-class young man from Hartford would have chosen to sketch a scene such as this view of a factory on the city of Hudson's waterfront, spewing smoke and steam, which merges with the Baroque drama of a stormy sky. Unlike Cole, Church was not a man of words or diaries, so it is through his images and later deeds that we must look for the seed of environmental consciousness planted by his mentor. Empathy and anthropomorphic analogy are at the heart of Church's study of trees throughout his life. Here are a range of sketches from his travels of lightning blasted, contorted, and rock-bound trees, all capturing the tree as the vehicle for expressing the power and sublimity of nature and the persistence of life in adversity. Certainly the most heroic native tree in Church's oeuvre is the charter oak of Connecticut, which you see in his meticulously labored pen and ink sketch from August and September 1846. Having just left Cole's tutelage, he had chosen this subject to make the focus of a finished painting, as he wrote to Cole on October 17th, 1846, saying, quote, "I've made a careful drawing of the charter oak, intending to paint it on a pretty large canvas during the coming months," end quote. This mythic oak tree was the perfect subject for the ambitious young landscape painter, for its rich and colorful history would elevate his canvas to the status of history painting, the most prestigious of the painter's genres, while remaining a pure landscape. Ultimately, Church completed 3 paintings of the charter oak. You see that at Olana here. For those of you not familiar with Connecticut's mythic arboreal savior, the charter oak stood until 1846 on the Willis farm in Hartford, where, legend has it, the first family on the land, Samuel Willis, the first of the family on the land, Samuel Willis, had been approached by a delegation of native people who encouraged him to spare the tree, saying it had been ceremonially planted by their ancestors when they first arrived in the area. But this was not the tale that Church and his audience would have summoned to mind, for the tree took its name from an incident that took place on October 31st, 1687, when agents of King James II attempted to take possession physically of the colony's royal charter, granted by Charles II in 1662. Rather than surrender it, an ancestor of Daniel Wadsworth's hid the parchment in the hollow of the tree until the authorities called off the search. While this did nothing to avert the restriction of the colony's rights under King James, the story presented Connecticut's colonial forefathers as having been on the right side of history. Moreover, there was a much more personal resonance to the charter oak for Church, as his ancestor Richard Church was among the founding proprietors of Hartford. And by presenting this subject on a large scale for exhibition, he was proclaiming his social status and deepening connections with Hartford society and its patrons of the arts, especially Wadsworth, who would be anchors to his initial success. Indeed, as a descendant of a distinguished Connecticut forefather, Church was among those offered pieces of the charter oak when it collapsed in a storm in August of 1856. You can see the chair he had fashioned out of these limbs in his library at Olana today, circled here in red. Church's breakthrough to international art star status came with his sublime rendering of Niagara in 1857, the first of what he termed his great pictures, and great in size and scale in particular. Niagara is 5 feet high and 10 feet wide, and he exhibited these in one painting shows around the country, charging 25 cents admission, which amounted to a huge sum if you consider that in the first 2 weeks on display in New York, 100,000 people purchased tickets, all the time building press, critical acclaim, and the value of the painting itself. Church's Niagara was also an important element of the campaign to restore and preserve this natural wonder as the Niagara Reservation in 1885, the first state park in the country, a cause that Church directly participated in. The pinnacle of Church's critical success and fame came with The Heart of the Andes, as you see here, in 1859. This immensely ambitious painting was the must-see phenomenon of its day. It toured 6 US cities and London, and the public reaction was ecstatic. The most memorable quote amongst the reviews is Mark Twain's that you see here. And the painting was eventually purchased by the collector William Blodgett for $10,000, the largest sum ever paid for a painting in the country at that time, and when the average price for a landscape by an artist of some status was $70. Church was an internationally celebrated artist and a financially successful one as well. What set Church's The Heart of the Andes apart from other large-scale landscapes of the era, such as those of his principal rival, Albert Bierstadt, was that it was the artist's direct response to the groundbreaking work of the world's most famous natural scientist, Alexander von Humboldt. Here, on a monumental scale, Church sought to capture Humboldt's theory of the unity of nature in depicting the Andean ecosystem, not a particular place in the Andes, but an idea, the idea of Humboldt's that had been generated by his travels through this same region. Church was celebrated in the press as the American Humboldt. The first volume of Humboldt's Cosmos had been published in 1845, the second in 1846. Both were translated into English in 1847, and within 3 years, 40,000 copies of the English translations had been sold. This was just as Church was plunging into the world of New York's artistic and social circles. And his introduction to Humboldt was part of the contemporary wave of enthusiasm for the Prussian naturalist writings. Moreover, Humboldt's ranking of landscape painting among the 3 highest expressions of human love of nature and identifying landscape artists as key intellectual workers who could translate his ideas to the public would have resonated strongly with Cole's teachings. In his copy of the second volume of Cosmos, Church annotated the quote you see here, essentially an elevated description of the academic process he had learned with Cole. Landscape painting requires for its development a large number of various and direct impressions, which, when received from external contemplation, must be fertilized by the powers of the mind in order to be given back to the sense as a fine work of art. The grander style of heroic painting is the combined result of a profound appreciation of nature and this inward process of mind. Humboldt's soaring prose inspired Church to take 2 trips to South America. He undertook the first expedition in 1853 and sought to follow as closely as possible the route south through Colombia and Ecuador that Humboldt had taken in 1801 to 1802. 5 months and over 1,000 arduous miles. This is the expedition that generated the concept of the Heart of the Andes. His second trip 4 years later brought him directly to Ecuador and the area around Chimborazo to undertake specific studies for the great picture. On both journeys, he filled his sketchbooks with botanical, geological, architectural, and anthropological observations. He also engaged with the local population, even trying his hand at portraiture, as seen here, and keeping a diary in faltering Spanish. He completed numerous oil studies on plein air, sometimes astride a donkey, many of them directly inspired by his reading of Humboldt. Here you see his illustration of Humboldt's concept of Luftmeer, or atmosphere. And many of them are stunningly beautiful in themselves to our contemporary eye, such as that here, Chimborazo at sunset, now hanging at the stair landing on the 2nd floor at Olana. Church would continue this expeditionary approach to landscape study and painting. Everywhere he traveled, he meticulously documented the natural environment, making each forest his native forest. Here you see studies from Jamaica, Bavaria, and Mexico. There are hundreds more from Labrador, Newfoundland, Greece, Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. However, no matter where Church traveled, the ecosystem that was foremost in his mind was that of his beloved Hudson Valley and the Catskills, that of Olana. The Heart of the Andes created the financial resources and personal motivation for Church to start on the 40-year-long project of creating Olana. For at one of the public viewings in his New York studio, he met the raven-haired beauty, Isabel Mortimer Carnes. Unless we think celebrity culture is a new thing, their courtship was covered in the broadsides, as you see here. They were married on June 14th, 1860. This was a marriage that lasted until their deaths, a year apart, May 1899 for Isabel and April 1900 for Church. It is remarkable and very significant for understanding Church's worldview that this famous global traveler of an artist decided to settle with his new wife and begin their family, not in New York City or a suburban location, but back up the Hudson River at the seat of his artistic consciousness. For in 1845, as a 19-year-old, Church had crossed the river from Catskill and trekked the ridge known as the Siegenberger Long Hill and sketched this view. This is in some sense Olana's founding document, the earliest surviving view from what would become Olana, then a site on a 126-acre farm known as the Breezy Farm. And 15 years later, 15 years after the sketch, he purchased this farm a month before his marriage at age 34. This is the view today, remarkably the same. Here you see a map showing the land use and boundaries of the Breezy Farm as it was in 1860. You can see that the property was roughly rectangular with an access road from what is today's Route 9G that skirts a wet but cultivated area here, and the letter A here identifies the location of an existing farmhouse built in the 1790s. Church hired the current occupant, Levi Simmons, to work the farm and allowed him to continue to live in the existing farmhouse. He also hired Theodore Cole, Thomas's son, as his farm manager and set about building a new house for his planned family, which he named Cozy Cottage. This is a view today as restored by the Olana Partnership in 2005. It now functions as our offices. Isabel and Frederic moved into Cozy Cottage in the early summer of 1861. They lived here for the next 10 years, referring to the property as the farm. And Church's correspondence is rich with references to his growing identity as Farmer Fred. Indeed, while Church's letter of July 7th, 1869, written to his close friend Erastus Dow Palmer on his return from a year and a half of traveling in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, contains the off-cited line, quote, "About an hour this side of Albany is the center of the world. I own it," end quote. Few appreciate that it starts, quote, "Here I am on my own farm," end quote, and that it was written from Cozy Cottage. Thus, developing and maintaining a working farm was fundamental to Frederic Church's vision for his property and his family's life in the country. Orchards were at the aesthetic heart of Church's working landscape. And here you see his oil sketch of apples in bloom that now hangs in the East Parlor, and one of many exuberant quotes from his correspondence of the period about the farm and the orchards. By 1867, Church had constructed a farm complex of 10 distinct buildings, including barns, a wagon house, and an ice house. An acre and a 1.4 acre kitchen garden was located south of the wagon house. You're seeing it here. And it provided a diverse selection of vegetables for the family and their servants, and also a cutting garden for floral displays in the main house. From the beginning, Church had ambitions beyond agriculture for the landscape. Here you see the view from the high point of Church's farm, a painting that he commissioned from Arthur Parton, a local artist, in 1864. This shows the highly worked landscape, the remnants of logging in the foreground, plowed fields stretching down the hill, and the largely deforested land, grazing pastures rolling down to the Hudson. For Church, who was by this time the preeminent artist in America and at the center of the New York art world, a fourth cousin of Frederick Law Olmsted and an intimate of Calvert Vaux, the shaping of Central Park out of just such a hardscrabble worked landscape could not have been far from mind. 1864 is also the year that the seminal text of American environmentalism was published, George Perkins Marsh's Man and Nature. The title page and inscription in Church's copy you see here. Marsh's writing was rooted in his travels as the US minister to the Ottoman Empire, where he understood the barren landscapes being the result of deforestation caused by intensive agriculture. He urged Americans to heed the lesson and avoid the desertification, as he called it, of their lands by restoring the natural balance through reforestation. And this is exactly what Church undertook during his first decade of ownership at Olana, planting thousands of trees, all native species, and gradually restricting the acreage under cultivation to the lower, more fertile portions of the property. In May 1864, he wrote to his father saying, quote, "My young trees are doing splendidly. Out of several thousand which I have planted within a year, I do not know that I have lost one," end quote. And this is the result as seen today from the same viewpoint as in Parton's painting, and much the same lush, picturesque landscape that was at the heart of Olmsted and Vaux's greensward plan for Central Park, their winning competition entry in that great project. Here is a plan of the changes wrought in the 1860s. This includes the beginnings of Olana's 12-acre lake, made by, quote, "getting out the muck," quote, end quote, from the wet cornfield, as Theodore Cole phrased it, a 20-year-long project that began in 1860. There is also the purchase in 1864 of 30 acres of steep west-facing hillside, with the goal, as Church wrote his father, quote, as he wrote his father, quote, "securing fine openings for the views," end quote. So that is this lot known as the Bethune lot over here. Here, Church embarked on his first large-scale carriage road building project, creating what remains today as a glorious ascent through his reforested woodland from the direction of the Hudson River ferry landing. In 1867, he purchased a narrow 6.5-acre strip here, extending north from the farm to intersect the main road to Hudson, a lot which he described to a friend as, quote, "all splendid woods," end quote, and where his first project on returning from his travels was the construction of a new entry road, the North Road. Also in 1867, he was able to purchase the 18 acres at the top of the hill here, above his farm, a wood lot belonging to a neighboring farmer, which he declared to Palmer, quote, "would make my farm perfect," end quote, clearly referring to the panoramic views it offered, but perhaps also to his plan of building a large house at the summit, the first mention of which appeared in the New York Observer on August 15th, 1867. However, his 18-month-long journey through the Eastern Mediterranean and Greater Syria intervened. On his return in June of 1869, Church plunged into the design of the main house and personally superintended its construction by local contractors through the next 4 years. Today, I'm not going to discuss this project undertaken in collaboration with Calvert Vaux in any great detail, but in a nutshell, in Vaux, Church found the perfect collaborator. The Englishman's design pedigree was tailor-made to address Church's preoccupations in creating his new home within the landscape setting of Olana. Vaux was steeped in the theory and practice of picturesque design, first in his training with Lewis Cottingham in London, and then in his partnership with Andrew Jackson Downing in Newburgh, New York. Church, the landscape artist, would have embraced Vaux's landscape-driven design approach, in which the siting of the house is the primary consideration, capturing views to, as you see here, and from the house, as you see here. During the same period that Church was building the main house at Olana, his fame brought him to the center stage of New York society and its major cultural undertakings. He was a founding trustee of the Metropolitan Museum, established in 1870 and taking up residence on its current site in Central Park in 1880 in Vaux's original building, as seen here. A decade later, Church was a member of the committee charged with determining the location of Cleopatra's Needle and deciding on placing it within view of the museum's entry to symbolize the union between the museum's collections and the landscape of the park. Church's involvement with Cleopatra's Needle perfectly represents his high profile as the leading art figure of the day. And it is not surprising that Vaux and Olmsted brought him in as a commissioner of Central Park, unifying art and nature, as Olmsted's quote here indicates. I can only imagine that involvement in the greatest projects of his time at the intersection of art and landscape further inspired Church and intensified his commitment to his masterwork at Olana. In the late 1870s, he purchased his final 2 parcels of land, completing his ownership of the ridge line to the north and adding 9 acres along the main road that allowed him to create a more gentle and graceful line of entry to the property, the one we take today from Route 9G here, and this being the northern portion of the ridgeline. It is in the 1880s that the churches adopt the name Olana for their property, and that Church dedicates the majority of his time to completing the design of Olana's landscape. Planting trees remained a preoccupation. During the hot, dry summer of 1885, he wrote to Palmer saying, quote, "I am anxiously awaiting my new hogshead. I depended on it for watering some young trees I set out this spring, and now many are dying," end quote. As late as 1889, he took delivery of over 2,000 evergreens. Some have suggested that just as Vaux collaborated on the main house, so Olmsted must have consulted on the landscape. But there are no archival smoking guns, and I hope that I have demonstrated by now how the preponderance of evidence testifies to Church's sole authorship of Olana's landscape, as inspired and informed by the example of his good friends and his involvement in their work in Central Park and beyond. One of the strongest testimonies to how Church saw himself extending his artistic practice into 3 dimensions is the construction of the extensive carriage drives in the 1880s. At the conclusion of 1884, that construction season in October, during which Ridge Road was built, which you see outlined in green here in the upper left, Church wrote to Palmer saying, "I have made about 1.75 miles of road this season, opening entirely new and beautiful views. I can make more and better landscapes in this way than by tampering with canvas and paint in the studio." This was the first carriage drive that Church had created purely for aesthetic pleasure, to reach and to shape views. In this case, to a view that he had painted over a decade earlier, which you see here in the Catskill Mountains from the Home of the Artist of 1871. And a view that was the first to be restored by the Olana Partnership in cooperation with New York State Parks 17 years ago. The restoration of other key Ridge Road views had followed. Here you see the North Meadow as it appeared in 2011, and as it appears now, having been restored in 2012 with views to Mount Marino in the city of Hudson and to the Berkshires and Green Mountains beyond. Immediately following Ridge Road in 1885, Church completed Crown Hill Road, another drive to a view, this time a view that encompasses all Olana from the farm to the main house. This arrow showing you that trajectory of the view plane. And here you see what the view from the top of Crown Hill looked like in 2012 and the result of its restoration in 2013. As dramatic and important as this project and the others preceding it were, they were undertaken in an ad hoc manner without a clear understanding of what the larger goals were for interpreting and operating the historic site. Therefore, just as the Crown Hill restoration was completed, our public-private partnership embarked on the development of a comprehensive strategic landscape design plan championed by the then Commissioner of Parks, Rose Harvey, and led by landscape architect Thomas Woltz of Nelson Bird Woltz. This was completed in June 2015, just as I arrived at Olana. The fundamental goal of the plan is to restore or rehabilitate all of Frederic Church's 250-acre historic landscape and to bring it forward into the core visitor experience. This is visualized in this heat map diagram showing the before and after states of visitor use. So clearly the before based on surveys of use for the plan, and the after based on the vision and the hopes of the plan. The numbers around this present a formidable challenge as well as a great opportunity. In 2021, over 200,000 people came to Olana, yet only 16% engaged in a tour of any kind or any programming for that matter. The majority turned off of Route 9G, sped through the designed landscape to the top of the hill, where they approached the main house from behind to seek a ticket in the carriage house, often to be told that they are sold out or they would need to wait a couple hours, and left to skirt around the foundations to see the view and leave, still not learning about Olana as a historic landscape or engaging in its spirit of place. Of course, this is not their fault. They are following the route of the existing limited visitor infrastructure, and the house will always have a capacity far below that of hourly visitor rates on busy days. So our plan is a 3-legged stool. The rehabilitation of the main house environs has been completed or nearly so. The other two legs will now proceed simultaneously starting in early 2023, the restoration of the historic farm complex and the construction of a new visitor entry and orientation facility, the Frederic Church Center for Art and Landscape. It will be located out of view of Olana's historic core landscape, including the main house, below the lake, and adjacent to the current vehicular entrance from Route 9G. You see that circled area here on the upper left. Designed by Architecture Research Office, the AIA National Firm of the Year in 2020, in collaboration with Nelson Bird Woltz, the Frederic Church Center is intentionally modest and clearly modern, a 21st century service building for Olana. It will be a base camp for exploring all of Olana. Its program is very simple. Provide for visitors immediate physical needs with a restroom and cafe, and address their psychological needs on arrival by answering the FAQs. Where am I and what can I do? Olana ambassadors, real live humans, will guide them through a range of options for interpreter-led or self-guided tours and walks. And in the spacious lobby, they will book tickets or check in for online ticket purchases and proceed to the cafe and multipurpose room beyond to engage with orientation displays and to plan the details of their visit. The orientation displays will speak to the sustainable design and carbon neutral construction of the new building itself. ARO's design embraces wood as a sustainable material through its use of mass timber, which features a cross-laminated timber known as CLT roof structure, as well as engineered wood columns and beams. The exterior walls of the building are clad in Accoya, a durable natural wood product. The mechanical system design utilizes all electric equipment and systems with air, water, heat pumps to provide heating and cooling. The domestic hot water is also designed around an all-electric building with on-demand heaters and low-flow restroom fixtures. This ensures that the building will not be reliant on fossil fuel energy. Electric consumption will be offset by an off-site solar array. Nelson Bird Woltz has set the building and parking lot within a landscape of native plantings in keeping with Church's practice. They have designed an entry plaza and outdoor seating area surrounding the building with stairs and an accessible pathway leading visitors to a terrace at the junction with Church's carriage road around the lake, this area here where you see one of our electric vehicles in this rendering. Here, Olana will present itself to them for the first time in this historic landscape composition created by Church. At a glance, visitors will understand that the house is but one actor in Olana's drama, and that to fully experience this place, one must move mindfully through its native woodlands and rise gently to the hilltop, arriving at the main house as the culmination of their experience. As the United States' most prominent landscape painter, Frederic Church defined our national identity as inextricably linked to the majesty of the natural world. At Olana, Church worked as architect and landscape architect, marrying aesthetic endeavor and environmental action by reforesting 250 acres of overworked land to create his home and designed landscape. Church engaged with these issues on a national level as a commissioner of Central Park in the 1870s, and by championing the first state park in the nation, the Niagara Reservation, in 1885. As the stewards of Olana and the champions of Church's legacy, we believe that the Frederic Church Center, as we're calling our new entry facility, will transform the visitor experience and elevate public understanding of Olana as the national landmark at the intersection of art and environmental consciousness, the product of a creative mind steeped in our native forest and Humboldt's genius to create, quote, the monument of Emerson's Thoreau's and Whitman's America. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was so inspiring, and I just loved hearing all of that. I know I have plenty of questions myself, but I just want to put a call out to those who are in attendance. If you have any questions, please send them through. We do have one that just came in from an anonymous attendee. So before we jump to some of my questions, I'd love to kind of turn it to one of our attending responses. How many varieties of trees are there at Olana today? And do we know how many Church may have planted or seeded? What are the varieties? I think with that, a question I have is, to what extent do we know how many of the trees that are on site are ones that Church may have planted?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that when I first arrived, had read through a lot of this material and was trying to, reconcile it with what I was seeing. I was, just fascinated to think. I've always loved trees myself. I wish I were an artist that could capture them with such beauty and sensitivity. So I think there are a few trees that are most maybe we know, for instance, right, that Gene Shin's project last year, that hemlock, that was ring dated by counting the rings to the time of of just after the main house body had been completed, 1872, 74. So it makes sense that the equipment is gone, the workers are gone, they're starting to plant the landscape. That tree was planted on the approach to the house, a hemlock, a native hemlock, very symbolic, as Gene did such a great job, opening our eyes to. And I've walked around, there's a big oak right up by the front door. That has to be the same sort of era, right? Oaks are even more slow growing. Who knows? Maybe it was one lone tree left in the woodlot that the church bought. I don't know. I would love to know more. I've walked around in the winter when the ticks is such a concern, the whole edges of the property. And down in the farm fields where the big orchards were, you can find the old fence line. And the trees are no longer standing, but you can see where the old fence line went around big old trees that certainly church knew. And on the road, the North Road piece connect right past Cozy Cottage, there is a big old oak that is long dead. It's a scary tree because I've seen those trees collapse. So I walk by it very quickly. It's on our dead tree list, but it is immense. It has to have been there for church. What did he plant it? I don't know. And honestly, the great majority of trees at Olana today are just descendants of church's trees. But there would not be the type of forest, the pattern of forestation at Olana if church had not planted those tens of thousands of trees. And the soil is thin. The soil in many places, trees are growing with 6 inches and rock below them. So we lose a lot of trees with wind. I think historically that's been the case. We know in the 1980s, there was a big loss of a hemlock grove with a big windstorm, for instance. So few of the trees we see today are church's trees per se, but they are churches in genealogy, I suppose. And then the varieties we know from what's there today. They are largely oak, maple, a variety of different oaks, I have to say. There are other native like hornbeam, which is a fascinating tree, ironwood. We did a tree talk a couple winters ago. I found fascinating. We should do another tree walk and talk. That's great. Hemlock, of course. There's a hemlock grove at the bottom of the lake that survives. That clearly is planted in a place that next to the water with ledges, just like you see it in the Catskills and would have been. So it's almost like a recreation of that native atmosphere of the Catskills. So.
Yeah, I love the point that you mentioned that without church's intervention, a lot of these trees, would not be there today. And I think something that's so fascinating that I often try to drive home to visitors is the ways in which this aesthetic impulse in some capacity kind of has this longstanding environmental impact. I think that that's something that's such an important legacy of church's choices and aesthetic choices for that matter. We have a question from the Olana Partnership's own Patrick Grego. Are there any other documents or journal entries that express church's vision or hopes for the future of Olana after his passing and beyond?
No, not really, as far as I know. I mean, things are being discovered all the time. Letters come up in eBay. Often archives only have one half of correspondence and the other half shows up in other places. And so who knows? But, we know the most from a 1890 article, pretty long write-up on creating Olana and it as the church's home that was published, I think, in a Boston paper. I forget the exact name of the paper at the moment. Bunnell was the author. And in that, that's the closest we get to some of this documentation. That's where the quote about planting, the first 10 years I was there, all I thought about was trees, planting trees, right? The legacy of what would happen to Olana, well, we know that it was planned that the youngest son would inherit it and he would manage it as a farm, that he had hopes, the big barn that is the last big historic building to be restored at Olana, on our list and underway, but in planning stages. That was completed in the spring of 1890, just as church was dying. And that was really for the sons and his farming endeavors and hopes. So but no, there's not a sense that it was going to be like, some museums like the Soane Museum in London, he set up an act of legislation to make it a national monument. It was that sense of self. I think, in many ways, Church was an interesting combination of, great accomplishment, celebrity, but, came from that kind of Connecticut Yankee Protestant idea that you shouldn't be too proudful, right? It's one of the 7 deadly sins. And that's how I understand the dining room at Olana. It's not hung with Church's great paintings. It's hung with the paintings of the past. And he can then, through that conversation, show how great he is, because those paintings are pretty dark and horrible looking. I don't know. That's my pet theory about the dining room.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think with that, I was wondering, it's kind of an imaginative question, but what do you think, with your kind of intimate proximity with Church, kind of, doing this talk and working at the Olana Partnership for many years, what do you think he would make of the current plans, the landscape design plan, and the Church Center that's coming forth? When you were describing the legions of folks who come on and kind of drive up and experience the house environs in that capacity, what would Church make of?
Well, we've certainly kept that foremost in our mind. I mean, what also, it's a public park, and we keep that very foremost in our mind. And this building is not going to inhibit access. It's going to improve access. It will be a free access building. You can come into it, the displays that will be there, which will be, promote, kind of promoting the bigger idea. They will not, the tour, that experience, that interaction is still central to the Olana Partnership's work. But, that will be free. And, what we hope that if people even come, not, because a lot of people just happen upon us, or, when we all have experienced that, we come someplace and like, oh, I wish I had more time. I'll come back sometime. But now, hopefully with this building, they'll see, oh, well, now I have a reason to come back. I'm definitely going to do that. I can plan a day here. And so, I do think, I hope the Church would be very approving of it. I think we've been very respectful of his legacy, because we resisted some calls to make the design a little house, a little Persian villa or something with lots of tiles and patterns. First of all, it's expensive, but it also just didn't seem the right thing to us. And so we found the perfect architect, who is one of those very few architecture firms who are first about the program, the use, the utility, but create a beautiful thing, but are not out to stamp it with their own style, basically.
And I certainly think some of the kind of environmentally minded choice making in terms of the material and how the building's operating, I imagine Church would be fascinated by some of those.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating.
Technologies.
We know certainly that in the barns, they recycled old barns, and that was a very common thing. I mean, it was done from colonial days, right? These great timbers were very valuable. You didn't just throw them away and get new timbers, right? But that was done down in creating the large barn complex in 1890. They recycled an earlier barn from mid-19th century that is part of it. And we have an interesting theory from a longtime Olana staff member that maybe the pump house down by the farm, which is a very distinct looking building. It's kind of odd, big flat roof, big windows, multi-pane, very sort of fancy for a pump house. That might have been a recycling of some of elements from Church's original studio, which he took down himself when he built the studio on the house. So, recycling is green, even if it's buildings too, especially green. So I think there is a precedent there.
Yeah. Speaking of the barn and the farm complex, we have another question coming through from one of our attendants. Will reseeding the orchard be part of the future plans to reestablish the farm area?
Yes, yeah, definitely. Some portion of orchard, I think, is essential. I do think it's the aesthetic heart of his farming enterprise. It was also the only portion that ever made any money to help pay the expenses of the farm. We know from the archival evidence we have, and there's references to the peach crop being one of the best. That was a Theodore Cole letter to Church, actually written when he was in the Mideast, saying you have the most amazing peach crop this season and you're missing it, but we're going to make the most of it. So yes, we do hope so. The first phase is to get the existing temporary parking lot that's been in place for, almost 20 years now, down at the farm, out of the way of where the original footprint was for the kitchen garden, and out of the view from Crown Hill. But the view from Crown Hill should come alive in what we're planning for the farm. We should get the kitchen garden area back. We would also, there was a portion of orchard there. And I think that's our first priority piece of orchard, because it is also in the view from Crown Hill, and therefore will recreate or rehabilitate at least one of Church's landscape compositions at Olana. The bigger orchard is a huge undertaking, and I do think that these projects are already catalyzing more interest and more possibilities, and I think in the future we'll hopefully have some partners to help us with that. And but anyone goes into agriculture has to tread lightly and thoughtfully. It's a financially risky endeavor.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So I just want to put a final call out for some questions. So Jonathan, one of our wonderful interpreters, just chimed in. Where food from the future kitchen garden might be directed? So an interesting question about this kind of future forward looking in terms of our future plans. What might be some of the possibilities?
Oh, that's going to be, I'm going to pass that to Carolyn, but not expect her to answer it right now.
Well,
but, I do see, that we've always had our educational base in the Wagon House, and that's been our classroom. And in many ways we've outgrown it, but, it's, I think, we'll still stay that at the heart of it, because I do think, and having done this talk this summer and read back through all the correspondence, it really reinforces to me that I think the soul of Olana for Church was at the farm. I think that was his impulse to be a landscape painter. I think that was, that if there is a, there's lots of talk about sort of theology in church and the Hudson River School. And, it's not that it's a piousness, but it's a respect, a sense of stewardship. I love that word, stewardship, right? And you don't have to own something to take care of it. And that's how we feel at the Olana Partnership about Olana State Historic Site. All of the people of the state own it, therefore, really by extension, the larger public, and we are stewards. We are here to help support it, to bring it forward educationally. The food could go in many different directions. I worked at the National Trust, with the National Trust in England, and a lot of their gardens, they were able to make salads in the cafe. What a wonderful thing, right? You're experiencing that same thing. So that would be great. But could those salads be made by young people or older people who are training in the hospitality trade? I don't know. Could there be a partnership with CIA or the Sylvia Center or others to create educational impact out of that as well? Yes. First of all, it will never be something that's like part of our profit center earned income. We don't make a profit. We're nonprofit. But, in that sense, because, every place that has tried with food has found, and even the most successful restaurant finds that, it's a very thin margin. So I would love to see it be meaningful. I mean, there are tricky things that no one could anticipate. I had never really thought about, which is the water source, that to water and irrigate the garden has to be tested and meet Department of Health standards to be able to use the food for public consumption. There's a much higher bar than your home garden for something that has public use.
Right. Yeah, I think I'll just add to that and say, I think from an educational standpoint, there's so many possibilities. And I think when we're thinking about, I love your framing, Sean, of the farm as the kind of soul of the site and of Church's engagement with this development of Olana. But I also think that there's so many rich programmatic and interpretive possibilities in the kitchen garden, because I think food is democratizing. Everyone eats, everyone, enjoys a meal with friends, family, or alone. And I think that there's, in some of the ways that we've kind of dabbled in interpreting the farm thus far with partnerships with organizations like the Sylvia Center, that's really come home. We've really seen that happen. So I think that, Jonathan, to your point, there's definitely a lot of possibilities, and I would be eager to explore. So if anyone has any kind of local farm organizations that we should be looking at and looking to, please type in the chat or reach out to me at education@olana.org, because
we're actively dating.
We're actively dating organizations to see if there's opportunities. Yeah.
And we shouldn't do everything. We can't do everything. And we should be an accelerant to other partnerships and to other people's goals that may be affiliated, but not directly what ours are. Ours are all about this place, this amazing, amazing place, Olana. And I, gosh, there was some other thought that Jonathan's question raised for me, but anyway, I'll let it go for the moment.
Great. So we are at 7 o'clock. So if anyone has any final thoughts or questions, please feel free to chime in. But otherwise, thank you all so much for joining us. It was really wonderful and a wonderful kickoff to our fall season of webinars. So please stay tuned for our future webinar in November. And we have a slate of wonderful webinars coming up for the winter as well.
And also, those of you who don't know this yet, we are having our first winter exhibition this year, which will explore
Absolutely.
another aspect of church, which is icebergs, adventure, and chromatic, the physics of color and and color theory and these things that he was exploring in the iceberg painting. So he was a man who was constantly looking for new subject matter and new revelations in the world of science.
Chasing Icebergs opens next month, so stay tuned for
November
that as
19th
well.
is the members opening. Yep. Okay.
All right. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.